June 21st, 1941. The border between German-occupied Poland and the Soviet Union. Darkness hangs heavy, thick with the smell of pine, diesel fumes, and the nervous sweat of millions of men. A German Panzer crewman, perhaps from the 18th Panzer Division, leans against the cold steel of his Panzer III. He checks his watch. He is bored, arrogant, and utterly confident. His division, his army, is the single greatest military instrument ever assembled. They have just spent a year proving it. They had crushed Poland in weeks. They had humiliated France, the supposed great power of Europe, in just 6. The British had been chased ignominiously into the sea at Dunkirk. Now, they faced the Soviet Union, an army they believed to be a clumsy, decapitated giant, led by incompetence and equipped with tractors. The Wehrmacht did not just believe it would win, it knew it. This was not a war they were starting. It was a mopping-up operation. This absolute, unshakable confidence was not simple propaganda. It was a core military doctrine. This is the story of T-34 shock. It is not merely the story of a new tank. It is the story of a psychological atom bomb, a moment in 1940, one when the invincible Wehrmacht stared into the face of a machine that should not have existed, and for the first time felt the icy grip of strategic fear. This shock was born not in the mud of Russia, but in the triumphant dust of France. To understand the depth of the panic the T-34 would cause, one must first understand the towering height of the arrogance from which the Wehrmacht fell. The architects of this arrogance were men like General Heinz Guderian, the father of the Panzer arm. Guderian was a man of obsessive energy, a zealot for armoured warfare who had spent 2 decades fighting the conservative elements of his own military establishment. By 1941, he was vindicated. His memoirs, Panzer Leader, written with the clarity of hindsight, still vibrate with the offensive spirit that defined the Wehrmacht of that era. He wrote of the French campaign as the ultimate proof of his theories. His panzers had not just won battles, they had rendered the very concept of a static front obsolete. Guderian's entire philosophy was built on speed, on the psychological dislocation of the enemy. He believed, as he wrote, that in tank warfare, the victory usually goes to the side which has the most tanks. But this was a subtle misdirection. What he truly believed was that victory went to the side that used its tanks with the most audacious speed, concentrating them at the decisive point, the Schwerpunkt. His confidence in his equipment, the Panzer III and Panzer IV, was absolute. The Panzer III, armed with its 37mm or 50mm gun, was, in his eyes, the perfect duelist, an elegant machine designed to kill other tanks. The Panzer IV was its infantry support counterpart, a workhorse with a short 75mm howitzer. To Guderian, this was the combined arms team that had unlocked the secret of modern war. He had used it to bypass the Maginot Line, to trap hundreds of thousands of French and British soldiers. Why would it not work against the Soviets, an army he and the High Command viewed with contempt? The Wehrmacht's intelligence, the Fremde Heer Oost, had assured him that the Soviet tanks were primarily light, ineffective machines like the T-26 or the BT series, fast but thinly armoured. Guderian was preparing to fight the last war over again, a faster, bigger version of the French campaign. His confidence was the confidence of a proven professional. This view was echoed by the Wehrmacht's great strategic minds, chief among them General Erich von Manstein. In his work, Lost Victories, Manstein details the meticulous planning for the invasion of France, the Sichelschnitt or sickle cut. Manstein was a brilliant, cold and calculating strategist. His analysis of the Wehrmacht's 1,940 victory is telling. He attributes it to a new operational concept and a standard of training which the enemy could not match. He describes the Wehrmacht as an army at the absolute zenith of its capability. This confidence was infectious, trickling down from the High Command, OKH, to the youngest private. They were, in their own eyes, a new breed of warrior, a fusion of Prussian discipline and technological mastery. But this very success, this lost victory, contained the seeds of its own destruction. Manstein, for all his brilliance, revealed a critical flaw, a profound underestimation of the enemy. He, like the rest of the German General Staff, viewed the Red Army as a colossus on feet of clay. They remembered the Red Army's disastrous performance against Finland in the Winter War of 1939–40. They saw Stalin's purges of 1937, which had wiped out the majority of his senior officer corps, including the brilliant Marshal Tukhachevsky. They saw a primitive, agrarian society incapable of producing sophisticated weapons of war. This was not just an assumption, it was an article of faith, a core tenet of the National Socialist ideology that framed the war. Let us put this confidence into stark numerical terms. The industrial hammer of 1940 was not one of overwhelming numbers, but of devastating efficiency. In the Battle of France, Germany deployed approximately 2,450 tanks against a combined French and British force of over 3,300. On paper, the Allies were superior. The French Char B-1 was heavier and better armed than any German tank. The Sommelier S-35 was arguably the best medium tank in the world in 1940, but these were just numbers. The German victory was one of doctrine. Blitzkrieg was not a weapon, it was a system. It was the integration of air power, the Stuka dive bomber, mechanized infantry, and concentrated armor, all communicating via radio. The French tanks, by contrast, were often scattered, lacked radios, and were doctrinally shackled to the infantry, designed to fight a slow, methodical battle of attrition. The statistics of the victory were staggering. In 6 weeks, Germany shattered the French army, killing over 90,000 and capturing 1.8 million prisoners. The cost to the Wehrmacht was, by the standards of total war, shockingly low. Approximately 27,000 killed. The Panzer divisions had lost vehicles, certainly, but the system had been proven. They had achieved what their fathers in 1914 could not. They had broken the deadlock of the trench. They had won a war of movement. This, then, was the Wehrmacht that stood at the Soviet border on June 21, 1941. It was an army that had never lost. It was an army led by men like Guderian and Manstein who believed they had perfected a new form of warfare. It was an army equipped with Panzers that had defeated everything thrown at them. Their confidence was not just arrogance, it was a conclusion drawn from the data, from the greatest military victory in a century. They were about to launch the largest invasion in human history, Operation Barbarossa, with the full expectation of being in Moscow within 8 weeks. They were the masters of the world, and they had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them in the forests and fields of the East. The word shock was not in their vocabulary. It was about to be. The Wehrmacht's confidence in June 1941 was not just a matter of morale. It was a deep, material faith in their core weapon system, the Panzer arm. To the men of Guderian's Panzer groups, the tank was not merely a vehicle, it was the physical manifestation of their new doctrine. The Panzer III was the duelist, the thoroughbred. The Panzer IV was the workhorse, the heavy support. Together they were the synchronized, radio-linked fist that had shattered every army placed before them. The shock that was to come, the T-34 shock, was not just the discovery of a superior enemy machine. It was the sudden, terrifying realization that their own weapons, the very symbols of their invincibility, were inadequate, even obsolete. The fall from this height of confidence would be brutal, and it began with the assumed perfection of these two vehicles. The spearhead of the Panzer divisions, the vehicle Guderian had championed as the primary battle tank, was the Panzerkampfwagen III. By 1941, the most common variants, the Ausführung H and J, were considered masterpieces of engineering. The true genius of the Panzer III was not its armour or its gun, which were considered merely adequate. Its genius was in its design philosophy. It was a tank built around its crew. Specifically, It was the first tank in the world to perfect the three-man turret, a commander, a gunner, and a loader. This separation of duties was a tactical revolution. The tank commander, often a veteran NCO, was not forced to load or fire the main gun. His sole job was to command. He had a 360-degree vision cupola, a set of high-quality Zeiss optics, and most critically, a radio. He could see the battlefield, identify threats, direct his gunner, and coordinate flawlessly with the other tanks in his platoon. In contrast, contemporary French tanks like the Saumur S-35, though heavily armoured, often featured a one-man turret, forcing the commander to act as gunner and loader simultaneously, a crippling overload in the heat of battle. Soviet tanks, as the Germans understood them, were even worse, often lacking radios entirely. The Panzer III, therefore, was a social system, a mobile command centre. Its 50mm Quark, 38 litres divided by 42 gun, was a respectable weapon in 1940, perfectly capable of defeating the Polish 7TPs and French R-35 seconds. Its armour, at 30mm with spaced appliqué plates, had proven sufficient. After-action reports from the Battle of France were glowing. Crews praised the tank's reliability, its superb sights, and its tactical flexibility. It was, they believed, the ultimate expression of combined arms warfare. It was a duelist's rapier, precise and deadly. If the Panzer III was the rapier, the Panzer Kampfwagen IV was the sabre, the heavy support. From its inception, the Panzer IV was never intended to fight other tanks. That was the Panzer III's job. Instead, the Panzer IV was a Begleitwagen, or support vehicle, designed to ride alongside the Panzer III's and eliminate the true threats to an armoured advance: anti-tank guns, machine gun nests, and fortified infantry. Its key weapon reflected this role: the short-barreled 75mm Quark 37 litres divided by 24. This was a low-velocity howitzer, firing a large, high-explosive shell. It was, in essence, a mobile artillery piece. In the French campaign, it had proven its worth 1,000 times over, blasting entrenched positions to rubble and allowing the Panzer III's to sweep forward unmulged. Like the Panzer III, the Panzer IV's crew ergonomics were excellent. It featured a large, roomy turret, also with 3 men, and a dedicated radio operator in the hull. Its reliability was legendary. It was the dependable workhorse. German tank manuals from 1940 and 1941 emphasized this specialized dual-track system. A panzer company was a balanced organism. The commander would use his Panzer IVs to suppress a strongpoint, then order his Panzer IIIs to dirch, break through, and exploit the gap. This doctrine was sound, proven, and in their minds, unbeatable. The system was what mattered, and their system was perfect. The individual quality of an enemy tank was almost irrelevant, because no enemy possessed a comparable system times of Bewegungskrieg, war of movement. The industrial backing for this force was, however, the Wehrmacht's hidden vulnerability. This was the statistical hammer that would soon strike the Germans themselves. The perception of the Wehrmacht as an unstoppable, fully mechanized juggernaut was a myth, carefully cultivated by propaganda. In reality, on the eve of Barbarossa, German industry was struggling. In the entire year of 1940, German factories produced only 1,064 Panzer IIIs and 480 Panzer IVs. In the first 6 months of 1941, leading up to the invasion, they added another 850 Panzer IIIs and 233 Panzer IVs. When Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, the entire invasion force, the largest in history, fielded only about 960 Panzer IIIs and 440 Panzer IVs as its primary combat tanks. These numbers are shockingly small. The total German tank strength of around 3,350 vehicles was padded out by nearly 750 Panzer IIs, a light tank armed with a 20mm cannon, and over 1,000 captured Czech-built Panzer 38s. These were thin-skinned vehicles, totally obsolete for a modern tank versus tank engagement, and the High Command knew it. The German doctrine, therefore, was not one of overwhelming numbers. It was a high-stakes gamble on Qualität über Quantität, quality over quantity. They believed their superior training, peerless optics, tactical radio coordination, and the proven quality of the Panzer III and IV would allow a smaller, more expert force to encircle and destroy a larger, more primitive one. It was the doctrine of a surgeon, not a butcher. And so, the Panzer divisions rolled east. They were a finely tuned, intricate, and precise weapon, a rapier honed on the battlefields of France. The crews were veterans. Their commanders were the best in the world. Their machines were, they believed, the pinnacle of military technology, not just for their steel, but for their brains. They were a force designed for a fast, decisive duel against known, inferior opponents. They were about to drive their high-tech rapiers headlong into an industrial sledgehammer, a machine forged in a different universe of military design, a tank that cared nothing for their elegant tactics, their Zeiss optics, or their crew ergonomics. The Panzer III and IV were the finest tanks of 1,940. They were about to be proven fatally insufficient for the war of 1,941. The German Wehrmacht was a rapier, a finely engineered system of specialists. The Soviet Red Army was, in their estimation, a blunt force object, a steamroller of uneducated peasants and massed, obsolete equipment. This was the great paradox of the Eastern Front in 1941. The Red Army was, simultaneously, one of the most incompetent and one of the most technologically advanced militaries on earth. The Wehrmacht, blinded by their own ideological and racial arrogance, could only see the incompetence. They were about to be crushed by the technology. Their entire understanding of the war, of their enemy, and of their own superiority was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The German High Command's contempt for the Soviet Union was not a secret. It was their official, strategic doctrine. The Wehrmacht's intelligence service, the Times Fremde Heer Oost Times, Foreign Armies East, provided the General Staff with assessments that were, in retrospect, criminally optimistic. They saw the chaos of Stalin's Great Purge of 1937, which had seen over 35,000 officers, including Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the Red Army's foremost armor theorist, imprisoned or executed. They saw the Red Army's pitiful performance in the 1939 Winter War against Finland, where a tiny, brave nation held the Soviet giant at bay for months. General Franz Halder, the chief of the OKH General Staff, famously summarized this view in his war diary. Just days into the invasion, he would write with breezy confidence, "I have been underestimating the Russian colossus. It is a colossus on feet of clay." This phrase became the Wehrmacht's epitaph. Halder and his staff were convinced that the Soviet state was a rotten structure that would collapse with a single, hard kick. They estimated the Red Army had perhaps 200 divisions, and that once those were encircled and destroyed in the border battles, there would be no organized force left to defend Moscow. Their intelligence on Soviet tank production was even worse. They knew of the light T-26 seconds, a copy of a British design, and the fast BT series Christie tanks. They dismissed them as thin-skinned and poorly built. The Wehrmacht expected to fight, and easily defeat, an army from 1,935. What they did not know was that the purges, while gutting the army's leadership, had failed to stop a quiet, tectonic revolution in its design bureaus. Hidden from the world, two men had been forging the weapons of Germany's destruction. In the industrial heart of Ukraine, at the Kharkov Locomotive Factory, KHPZ, a designer named Mikhail Koshkin had created an abomination, a tank that broke all the rules. His T-34 was the direct descendant of the American J. Walter Christie's M1928 suspension, which the Soviets had purchased. The Christie system, with its large road wheels and slack track design, allowed for unprecedented off-road speed. But Koshkin and his team had added 3 revolutionary concepts. First, they gave it wide, 50-centimeter tracks, giving it a ground pressure so low it could float over the deep mud and snow that would immobilize every German Panzer. Second, they gave it a V2 diesel engine, a powerful and, critically, less flammable engine than the gasoline power plants used by the Germans. Third, and most important, Koshkin draped the T-34 inches radical sloped armor. This was its secret. Instead of bolting on flat, 50mm plates as the Germans did, Koshkin angled his 45mm plates at 60 degrees. This simple geometric trick was a stroke of genius. A 50mm German shell striking this plate would not hit 45mm of steel. It would have to travel through the equivalent of 90mm of steel. Even more, the steep angle meant that most shells would not even penetrate. They would simply deflect, skittering off the hull with a terrifying shriek. While Koshkin built his masterpiece in Kharkov, another team under Joseph Kotin at the Kirov plant in Leningrad was building its big brother, the KV-1 heavy tank. Named for Defense Commissar Kliment Voroshilov, the KV-1 was a 45-ton monster, a slow-moving fortress with 75mm of flat armor, immune to every single anti-tank weapon in the German arsenal. Both the T-34 and the KV-1 were armed with 76.2mm guns, high-velocity weapons that were not specialized anti-tank or infantry support guns. They were all-purpose tank killers, capable of destroying a Panzer III from 1,000 meters, far outside the Germans' effective range. Now, for the industrial hammer. These were not prototypes. They were not one-off technical exercises. When the Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941, they fielded a total of 3,350 tanks, of which only about 1,400 were the Invincible Panzer III and IVs. The Red Army, according to German intelligence, was supposed to be a vastly inferior force. The reality, unknown to Halder, Guderian, or Manstein, was that the Soviet Union possessed the largest tank-producing industry on the planet. On that day, the Red Army had an inventory of over 22,000 tanks. This number was, in itself, staggering. But the true terror was hidden within it. While most were indeed obsolete light tanks, the Red Army already had, in service, approximately 968 tons, 34 seconds, and 508 kilovolts 1 second. The Red Army of 1,941 was a two-headed monster. It was an army with its brain, its officer corps, surgically removed by Stalin, leading to catastrophic failures in command, communication, and supply. Its frontline units were disorganized, badly led, and would be encircled by the millions. But it was also an army that possessed a secret, ultra-modern steel core. The Germans saw only the first head. They saw the chaos. They saw the clumsy giant. They were about to be killed, in horrifying numbers, by the second. The first encounters were about to happen, and the psychological foundation of the entire Wehrmacht was about to crack. The last week of June, 1941. The Wehrmacht is not just advancing, it is exploding across the Soviet frontier. In the south, Army Group South is driving into the fertile Ukraine. In the north, Army Group North is slashing toward Leningrad. And in the center, Army Group Center, the main effort, has just closed the gigantic Minsk pocket, encircling 500,000 Soviet soldiers. The victory seems total. The Panzer divisions are averaging 50 kilometers a day. The confidence of the men is boundless, their arrogance justified by every burning Soviet tank they pass. And they pass thousands. The roadsides are littered with the wrecks of T-26 seconds and BT-7 seconds, flimsy machines that pop apart with a single, contemptuous shot from a Panzer III. The German advance is a moving wall of fire, and every encounter confirms their racial and technological superiority. This is not a war, it is a rout. Then, the rumors begin. They start in the anti-tank units. the Times Panzerjäger *, the men who are supposed to protect the infantry from enemy armour. A gun crew from the 16th Panzer Division, positioned in a wheat field, hears the rumble. They wait, confident in their 3.7 centimeters Park 36. This is the standard German anti-tank gun. It is light, accurate, and has killed every tank it has ever faced in Poland and France. It is, they joke, the Heeresangklopfgerät, the army door knocker. A shape emerges from the morning mist, a low, wide, predatory silhouette they do not recognize. The Richtschütze Mal, Gunnar, aims, firing his Panzersprengranate. High-explosive anti-tank. Round. A direct hit. A metallic Mal Klang. Mal rings out. The tank does not stop. He fires again. Asterisk. Clang asterisk. Another hit right on the front. The tank keeps coming. The crew fires a third, a fourth, a fifth time desperately. The shells are bouncing off the sloped front plate, skittering off the armour like peas off a drum, as one report would later describe it. The T-34, for that is what it is, does not even bother to stop. It does not even fire its main gun. It simply accelerates, its wide tracks churning. The crew, now screaming in panic, realizes it is too late to run. The tank, with an indifferent mechanical roar, drives directly over their gun pit, crushing the Park 36 and its crew into the soft earth. This scene is repeated across the front. The door knocker is useless. The men are terrified. They begin to aim for the tracks, for the vision slits, for anything, but the tank is impervious. The shock, however, is most acute not for the infantry, but for the panzer crews themselves. They are the elite. They are the duelists. Their Panzer IIIs are their pride. A report from a tanker in the 6th Panzer Division, fighting near the Grodno salient, describes the first duel. We spotted a new type of Russian tank, low, sleek, and fast. We opened fire at 800 meters. A hit, no effect. We closed to 600 meters. Another hit, on the turret. No effect. The crew was yelling, "It's not stopping." The German commander, secure in his superior optics and training, fires again. 2 more hits. The T-34, as if annoyed, finally stops. Its turret, with a menacing slowness, rotates. A bright, white flash, a 76, 2mm shell, travelling at over 600 meters per second, smashes into the front plate of the Panzer III. It does not just penetrate, it shatters the 50mm plate, sending a white-hot cone of spall and an exploding shell into the crew compartment. The Panzer III is instantly geköpft, decapitated, its turret blown clean off, its crew vaporized. The German panzer crews are confronted with a nightmare. Their entire tactical doctrine is based on their ability to kill the enemy at a range where the enemy cannot effectively kill them. The T-34 has reversed this equation. It can kill the Panzer III from 1,000 meters, 1,500 meters, a range where the German 50mm gun is utterly useless. The math is simple, brutal, and, for the Germans, inescapable. This is the industrial hammer of 1,941, the German Park 36 anti-tank gun, firing its standard armor-piercing round, could penetrate approximately 34mm of armor at 100 meters. At any normal combat range, it was much less. The Panzer III's 50mm Quake 38 liters divided by 42 gun, its main weapon, could penetrate about 40mm at 500 meters. Now, consider the T-34. Its front glacis plate was 45mm of steel, but, crucially, it was sloped at 60 degrees. This simple geometry gave it an effective line of sight armor thickness of 90mm. It was, therefore, mathematically impossible times for the vast majority of German hardware in 1941 to destroy a T-34 from the front. It did not matter how good the German gunner was. It did not matter how superb his Zeiss optics were. He was firing a weapon that could not, by the laws of physics, do its job. The only way to kill a T-34 was with a desperate, suicidal flanking shot at point-blank range, or with a lucky hit from the Luftwaffe's 88mm anti-aircraft guns, which were not yet deployed as a standard anti-tank weapon. These reports, when they first filter back to the High Command, OKH, are met with total disbelief. General Franz Halder, the man who had called the Red Army a colossus on feet of clay, dismisses them. In his diary, he writes off the reports as exaggerations. The field commanders, he assumes, are suffering from combat hysteria. They must be encountering a few isolated experimental prototypes. It is impossible, unthinkable, that the subhuman Slavs could have mass-produced a tank superior in every single metric: armor, speed, and firepower to the best of German engineering. The Wehrmacht's entire ideological and military foundation rests on this impossibility. But on the front, the men who are being burned alive in their Panzers know the truth. The ghost story is real. The shock is just beginning. The anecdotes of panicked anti-tank gunners in Part 4 were just the tremor before the earthquake. The full, operational crisis, the moment when T-34 shock became a strategic reality that could halt an entire army, arrived just days into the invasion. It happened in Lithuania, near the sleepy town of Raseiniai. Here, the 4th Panzer Group, part of Army Group North, was pushing hard toward Leningrad. Its spearhead, the 6th Panzer Division, was about to be stopped cold, not by an army, but by a single, terrifying machine. The 6th Panzer Division, under the command of General Major Franz Landgraf, was a veteran unit. It had fought in Poland and France. But its primary battle group, Kampfgruppe Raus, was about to make history. On June 23, 1941, as Kampfgruppe Raus advanced, it ran into elements of the Soviet 2nd Tank Division. The fighting was fierce, but the Germans, with their superior tactics, pushed the Soviets back. They secured a bridgehead over the Dubisa River and prepared to continue their lightning advance. Then, the next morning, a single Soviet tank appeared. It was a KV-1. It drove to a key crossroads and simply stopped, its engine idling. It sat there, alone, blocking the only road that Kampfgruppe Raus could use for supplies and reinforcements. The account of what happened next, detailed in the memoirs of the Kampfgruppe commander, Colonel Erhard Raus, is one of the most famous and chilling episodes of the entire war. At first, the Germans were not worried. They were annoyed. Raus ordered a battery of 50mm PK-38 anti-tank guns to be brought up. They unlimbered, took careful aim at the giant, boxy target, and opened fire. The shells hit the KV-1 with a series of loud, metallic clangs asterisk, and they all bounced off. The KV-1, as if swatting a fly, slowly rotated its turret and destroyed all the German guns, one by one, with its 76.2mm cannon. The situation was now serious. Raus was cut off. He ordered a 105mm field howitzer to be brought up for a direct-fire point-blank engagement. The artilleryman manhandled the heavy gun to within 800 meters and fired. Another direct hit. The shell exploded, but when the smoke cleared, the KV-1 was still there, unscratched. It turned its turret and destroyed the 105mm howitzer. Now there was panic. The Germans brought up an 88mm anti-aircraft gun, the only weapon in their arsenal capable of killing this beast. But the KV-1's crew spotted it and destroyed it while it was still setting up. For 24 hours, a single Soviet tank held an entire German battle group of thousands of men hostage. It destroyed a dozen supply trucks that tried to run the blockade. It sat there, impervious, a 45-ton symbol of the Wehrmacht's sudden impotence. Finally, in the dead of night, Raus ordered a squad of Pioniere combat engineers to sneak up to the tank with satchel charges. They managed to detonate their charges on the tracks and the barrel, but the tank remained. It was not until a second, desperate Pioneer attack managed to throw a charge, inside, times the tank's hull that it finally went silent. When the Germans cautiously approached, they found it had been hit by their Park 38 seconds and the 105mm howitzer dozens of times. The armour was pockmarked, but only 2 shells had actually penetrated. This was not a battle. It was an execution, and the Germans were on the wrong side. This was not an isolated incident. The Battle of Raseiniai was a meat grinder. The Soviet 2nd Tank Division, though badly led and ultimately destroyed by the Luftwaffe, launched a massive counterattack with both T-34 seconds and KV-1 second against the 1st Panzer Division, which was operating nearby. For the German Panzer crews, it was a waking nightmare. Their tanks were suddenly the inferior machines. They were the ones who had to score lucky mobility kills by hitting the tracks. They were the ones who had to call frantically for Stuka support, because their own guns were useless. The industrial hammer of Raseiniai is this. The 6th Panzer Division was a perfect example of the Wehrmacht's hidden weakness. It was not equipped with the Invincible Panzer IIIs and IVs. It was a times leichte times light division, a holdover from the early war, and was equipped almost entirely with the Czech-built Panzer 35T. The Panzer 35P was a small, reliable tank. It was also completely obsolete. Its main weapon was a 37mm Skoda A7 gun. This gun could, at 500 meters, penetrate approximately 30mm of armor. The KV-1, the tank it faced, had 90mm of armor on its turret front and 75mm on its hull and sides. Let us be clear on the mathematics. The primary tank of the 6th Panzer Division was firing a weapon that was, quite literally, 10 times too weak to damage its opponent at any range except, perhaps, point-blank against its thinnest rear armor. The Germans were throwing stones at a fortress. Their entire tactical and technological framework collapsed. The shock was no longer just a rumor from a terrified Times Panzerjäger Times crew. It was an official report, filed by a colonel, of a strategic-level failure. The Wehrmacht's rapier had just struck a wall of solid steel and shattered. The myth of invincibility died at that crossroads near Raseiniai. The crisis at Raseiniai was a tactical atom bomb, a localized event of profound, terrifying clarity. But for the shock to become a strategic reality, it had to travel from the front line to the high command. It needed a voice, a credible, powerful, and undeniable messenger who could break through the wall of arrogance and disbelief in Berlin. That voice belonged to the father of the Panzer Force himself, General Heinz Guderian. As the commander of Panzer Group II, the main armoured fist of Army Group Center, Guderian was not a regimental colonel like Raus. He was the man responsible for the main drive on Moscow. And in July 1941, as his divisions smashed through the Smolensk pocket, he ran headlong into the T-34. The shock was no longer a rumour. It was his new, daily reality. Guderian, a man of impatient, obsessive energy, was famously a frontline general. He did not command from a chateau. He commanded from his half-track, choking on the same dust as his men. This gave him an unvarnished, immediate view of the crisis. In his post-war memoirs, Panzer Leader, his voice is still sharp with the frustration and alarm he felt in those days. He was not a man to mince words. While Halder and the OKH staff were still dismissing the T-34 as a one-off or exaggeration, Guderian was seeing it with his own eyes. His veteran crews, the men who had rolled through France with almost contemptuous ease, were now being systematically slaughtered. He wrote in his reports, and later in his memoirs, of the T-34's shocking superiority in firepower, armour and mobility. He described the Wehrmacht's total technological helplessness. Up to this time, he wrote, "We had enjoyed tank superiority, but from now on the situation was reversed. This was a revolutionary, almost treasonous admission." Guderian went further. He provided a chillingly detailed account of the T-34's performance, noting its sloped armour, which gave it an effective thickness our shells could not defeat. He described how his Panzer IIIs were outclassed, and his Panzer IVs, with their short infantry support guns, were useless in a tank-to-tank fight. He was, in effect, reporting to his superiors that their primary war-winning weapon system was a failure. This created the great dual conflict of the 1941 summer campaign. It was not just Germans versus Soviets, it was the German Frontline versus the German High Command. On one side, you had the combat troops and field commanders like Guderian, who knew the material, physical, terrifying truth. On the other, you had the rear echelon staff officers of the OKH, chief among them General Franz Halder. Halder's war diary from this period is a study in willful ignorance and ideological blindness. He continued to dismiss the frontline reports. He wrote them off as combat fatigue or panicky. He could not, and would not, accept that the subhuman Slavs, the colossus on feet of clay, had produced a weapon superior to the finest products of Aryan engineering. But Guderian was relentless. He was a pragmatist. He was a tanker, not an ideologue. He did not care about racial theory, he cared about penetration statistics, and the statistics were screaming at him. The industrial hammer of the T-34's design was now forcing Guderian to make demands that were unthinkable just weeks earlier. He did not just ask for times more times tanks, he asked for times different times tanks, immediately. First, he demanded that the Luftwaffe's 88mm flak gun, the high-velocity anti-aircraft gun that had proven so deadly at Raseiniai, be taken from its air defense role and permanently assigned to his Panzer divisions as their primary anti-tank weapon. This was a logistical nightmare and a bureaucratic heresy, but Guderian knew it was the only gun they had that could kill a T-34 or KV-1 at combat range. Second, he made an even more radical, desperate plea. He demanded that production of the Panzer III, the tank he had championed his entire career, be times stopped asterisk. It was obsolete. It was a death trap. It was, as he put it, a failure. And then, the ultimate demand, the one that exposed the true depth of his panic. Guderian insisted that German engineers should not try to invent a new tank to fight the T-34. They did not have time. He demanded that they simply times copy times it. He proposed that German factories should immediately begin producing a direct, bolt-for-bolt replica of the T-34. This was the true moment of T-34 shock. It was the instant a German field marshal, the father of armoured warfare, admitted total defeat, not in battle, but in engineering. He was admitting that the primitive Soviet system had produced a weapon so perfect, so far beyond their own capabilities, that the only rational response was to steal the design. The shock was no longer about a single tank at a crossroads in Lithuania. It was a full-blown crisis of industrial and military doctrine. The Wehrmacht's confidence in its own technology, the very pillar of its blitzkrieg system, had collapsed. Guderian's pleas were the sound of that collapse. The men in Berlin could no longer dismiss the reports as hysteria. The voice was too loud, too senior, and too right. The panic was now official. November 1941. The gates of Moscow are visible, but the Wehrmacht is frozen in its tracks. The Times Rasputitsa asterisk, the seasonal mud, has given way to the even more terrifying general winter. The German advance has ground to a halt, not just from the cold, but from a crisis of material. And now, the panic on the front line has finally, irrevocably, reached the halls of power in Berlin. Guderian's pleas, backed by the reports of 100 Panzer commanders, can no longer be ignored. In a desperate move, the German High Command dispatches a special times Panzer Commission times, tank commission, to the front. They are not soldiers, they are the high priests of German industry. The delegation includes men like Dr. Ferdinand Porsche, the brilliant but eccentric designer, alongside senior engineers from the arm's most important contractors, Daimler, Benz and MAN. They arrive at Guderian's frozen headquarters, men in heavy civilian overcoats, looking utterly out of place, to conduct an autopsy on the machine that has broken their army. They are taken to a collection of captured T-34 seconds and KV-1 second, hauled back from the front. The engineer's initial reaction is one of pure, unadulterated contempt. The T-34 is, to their eyes, an appallingly crude machine. The welds are rough, jagged and sloppy. The armor plates are unfinished. The paint is caked on. The interior is a Spartan, oily, metal box, cramped and devoid of any crew comforts. It is, one engineer supposedly remarked, the work of subhumans, but this arrogance lasts only until they open their toolkits. The autopsy begins, and the contempt turns to icy, professional dread. First, the V2 diesel engine. The German engineers are stunned. It is an all-aluminum block, a 39-litre V12. This is a level of technology Germany's own vaunted industry has not achieved for a tank engine. It is light, powerful, and, most critically, it runs on diesel fuel. German Panzers ran on high-octane gasoline, a fuel that is not only in shorter supply but is terrifyingly flammable. The T-34's diesel engine is not just an engine, it's a strategic, logistical, and safety revolution. Second, the suspension. They examine the Christie-style system, the large road wheels, the wide 50-centimetre tracks. They realize, with a dawning horror, that this is the solution to the Times Rasputitsa asterisk. This is why the T-34 floats over the mud and snow, while their own Panzer IIIs, with their narrow, complex, and delicate tracks, are sinking to their hulls. Third, and above all, the armour. They pull out their calipers and protractors. They measure the glacis plate, 45 millimeters. Then they measure the angle, 60 degrees. The calculations are done in their heads, men who have lived and breathed this data their entire lives. They realize the effective armor thickness is 90 millimeters. It is a simple, brilliant, geometric solution that costs nothing to produce and yet makes the tank immune to their 50 millimeters guns. It is not just a tank, it is a different design philosophy. It is crude, simple, and absolutely, terrifyingly effective. The commission is now split. The copy versus engineer debate begins. Guderian, the soldier, is furious and pragmatic. He hammers his point home. Copy it. It is the most effective way. It works. Ours do not. Stop building our tanks and build this one. But the engineers, the industrialists, are horrified by the suggestion. Their final reports to Berlin argue that copying the T-34 is a technical and industrial impossibility. The Daimler-Benz engineers state flatly that German industry, optimized for quality and precision, cannot mass-produce a machine of such crude tolerances. They lack the specific steel alloys used by the Soviets. They cannot, without a total and catastrophic retooling of their entire industrial base, produce the V2 aluminum diesel engine. But the industrial hammer of this debate is not just about alloys, it is about philosophy. The T-34 was a weapon designed for a new kind of war, total, attritional, and industrial. The Times Panzer Commission Times discovered that the T-34 was designed for Times producibility asterisk. Soviet estimations, later confirmed, suggest a T-34 inches 1,941 required approximately 8,000 man-hours to complete. The German Panzer III, a lighter, less effective tank, required nearly 15,000 man-hours. The T-34 was not just a tank. It was a war-winning Times industrial weapon asterisk. It was designed from the ground up to be built by semi-skilled labor women, old men, teenagers in relocated factories in the Urals, in quantities that the German craftsman mindset could not even comprehend. The German Panzers were surgical instruments. The T-34 was a sledgehammer, designed to be built by the million. The autopsy is complete. The Times Panzer Commission Times returns to Berlin. Their final recommendation is a fateful, historic compromise, and a rejection of Guderian's pragmatic plea. They cannot copy the T-34. It is both technically impossible and a wound to their engineering pride. The answer, therefore, is not to copy the primitive design. The answer is to out-engineer it. They would take the T-34's best ideas, sloped armor, a long-barreled gun, and fuse them with superior German technology. A precision, engineered chassis, a high-velocity 75mm gun, and of course their peerless Zeiss optics. This fateful decision, this rejection of simplicity in favor of complexity, has just set Germany on the path to its next generation of tanks, the Panther and the Tiger. The T-34's armor had defeated the German 50mm shell. Its wide tracks had defeated the Russian mud. But the T-34's most devastating victory was not material. It was psychological. By the brutal winter of 1941, the T-34 was no longer just a tank. It was a myth. It was an omnipresent, indestructible bogeyman that haunted the German Lanzer Times infantryman in his frozen foxhole. It was the source of a new, debilitating combat fatigue, a specific terror that had no equivalent on the Western Front. Panzerangst ***, tank fear. It was the dawning, soul-crushing realization that their leaders had lied, that their technology was inferior, and that their sacrifice was, perhaps, in vain. This was a catastrophic collapse from the arrogance of June. German soldiers like Bernhard Bechler had departed for the Eastern Front with boundless optimism. As he later recalled, he reassured his sister at the station. "Listen, we will part now. In a few weeks I'll ring you from Moscow." He was, he said, utterly convinced that this would happen. That confidence was now a bitter, frozen memory. By November, the letters home from the front were no longer filled with bravado. They were filled with a cold, creeping dread. The Lanzer Times wrote of a new, terrifying sound, the high-pitched metallic squeal of the T-34's tracks and the deep, guttural roar of its V2 diesel engine. It was a sound that meant death, a sound they could do nothing against. Their Park 36 door knockers were useless, their grenades were useless, their rifles were useless. They were no longer the hunters of 1940. They were the hunted. The T-34 had inverted the battlefield. In France, the German infantry had advanced in the proud shadow of their own Panzers. In Russia, they cowered in holes, praying for the arrival of the Luftwaffe's 88mm anti-aircraft guns, the only weapon that could save them. This feeling of utter helplessness, of being abandoned by their own vaunted technology, was the core of the psychological wound. The Lanzer Times, was being asked to fight a modern, mechanized war with the weapons of 1918. He was being asked to charge a fortress with a bayonet. This terror was captured in the anonymous, hellish landscape of the front, a landscape now defined by the T-34. It was the sight of a young private, his intestines steaming in the snow, crying out, "Shoot me," to his comrades as they ran past, because they all knew the T-34, or the infantry behind it, would offer no quarter. This psychological rot was not confined to the enlisted men. It reached the very highest, most professional echelons of the Wehrmacht. The T-34 had broken the Times generals' ***, men who had been trained their entire lives in the Prussian code of quiet, professional superiority, were now filing reports filled with language that bordered on panic. The most stunning and most famous admission came from Major General Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin. Von Mellenthin was no hysterical subaltern. He was a brilliant, decorated general staff officer, the chief of staff of the 9th Panzer Division. In his post-war analysis, Panzer battles, his professional judgment was cold, clear, and absolutely damning. He wrote of the T-34's debut in 1941, "We had nothing comparable." This simple, 5-word sentence was an earthquake. It was a German general, an armor expert, admitting with unvarnished clarity that their entire industrial and design philosophy had failed. He admitted the T-34 had a profound effect on the morale of our tank men, and that the T-34, with its high-velocity 76mm gun, good armor, and remarkable cross-country mobility, was the finest tank in the world. The finest tank in the world. The admission was out. the psychological barrier was broken. The myth of Aryan German technological invincibility, a core pillar of the entire National Socialist state, had been proven a lie. And it was a lie that was now being paid for in the blood of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. This brings us to the industrial hammer of propaganda. How does a state, built on the myth of superiority, admit to its people that it is, in fact, inferior? The answer is, it does not. It changes the story. If you analyze the German newsreels, the Times Die Deutsche Wochenschau **, the shift from June 1941 to the winter of 1941 is stark. The newsreels of June, set to bombastic, triumphant music, are all about the Times Panzer **. The camera lingers on glorious low-angle shots of Panzer IIIs and IVs rolling endlessly across the steppe. They show cheering Ukrainian crowds and vast, pathetic columns of Soviet prisoners. The victory is effortless, a racial and technological destiny. By the winter, the T-34 has killed this narrative. The Times, Panzer Times, is no longer the hero because the audience and the soldiers on leave know it is a failure. So, Goebbels, in his cynical brilliance, creates a Times New Times hero. The lone Times Panzerjäger **. The newsreels change. The music becomes darker, more dramatic, set to the heroic strains of Liszt's Les Preludes. The new hero is the anti-tank gunner, a grim-faced man in a frozen hole, fighting Bolshevik hordes and Asiatic swarms. The camera now focuses on Times him **, on his personal, heroic sacrifice as he stalks the enemy monster. This was not a celebration of victory. It was a statistical and thematic admission of defeat. The Wehrmacht's primary offensive weapon, the tank, was now being upstaged in its own propaganda by a man with a grenade. The T-34's greatest weapon was not its 76mm gun. It was the Times idea, Times of its invincibility. It had shattered the Wehrmacht's most potent weapon, their belief in themselves. This psychological wound would never heal. The autopsy was over. The Times, Panzer Commission Times, had returned from the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, carrying their chilling report. The T-34 was not just a tank. It was an industrial and engineering revolution. The shock had now fully penetrated the Wehrmacht's high command, and, most critically, the Times Waffenamt Times, Army Ordnance Bureau. The panic was palpable. On the 25th of November 1941, the Times Waffenamt Times issued an urgent tender for a new medium tank, a direct counter to the T-34. The project was codenamed VK-30.02. It was a 30-ton tank, and it was to be Germany's salvation. The two industrial giants, Daimler-Benz, DB, and Maschinenfabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg, MAN, were given an impossibly short deadline to design and present their solutions. The industrial war had begun. The first proposal to arrive was from Daimler-Benz, the makers of the Panzer III. Their design, the VK-30.01D, was the pragmatic solution. It was, in essence, the tank Guderian had begged for. The Daimler-Benz engineers, humbled by their analysis of the captured T-34 seconds, had decided that the Soviet designers were, in most respects, correct. Their VK-30.01D was in all but name a German-built T-34. It directly copied the T-34's revolutionary layout. The engine and drive sprockets were in the Times rear asterisk. This was a critical, efficient design choice. It eliminated the need for a long, heavy, and vulnerable drive shaft running down the center of the tank, a flaw in every German Panzer. The DB design also featured a diesel engine, another lesson learned from the T-34's V2. Its armor was well sloped, and its turret was simple. It was a reliable, simple, and producible tank. It was, in short, the Times, Smart Times, choice. Then came the proposal from MAN. Their design, the VK-30.02M, was the Times' prideful Times choice. The MAN engineers, led by Paul Wiebig, looked at the T-34 not as a superior to be copied, but as a primitive challenger to be out-engineered. Their design was not a copy. It was an arrogant, brilliant, and complex German answer times to the T-34. It stole the Soviets' two best ideas: radical sloped armor and a powerful, long-barreled, high-velocity gun, the new 75mm Quab 42. But it wrapped these ideas in a package of profound, traditional, and ultimately fatal German complexity. The MAN design rejected the T-34's simple, efficient rear-drive layout. Instead, it clung to the traditional, flawed German layout. The engine was in the back, but the transmission and drive sprockets were in the Times front asterisk. This necessitated a massive, heavy drive shaft that ran right through the crew compartment, making the tank taller, heavier, and mechanically vulnerable. Why do this? Because it was the German way, and critically, it was compatible with existing transmission components. The MAN design also did not use a simple, rugged Christie suspension. It used a new, staggeringly complex Schachtelaufwerk interleaved suspension, with overlapping road wheels. This system gave a smooth ride but was a logistical and maintenance nightmare. A single damaged inner wheel requiring the removal of 5 outer wheels to fix. And finally, it would be powered by a high-performance, high-maintenance, and highly flammable gasoline engine, the Maybach 512. The industrial hammer of this contest was the fateful decision made in May 1942. A special commission, led by Minister of Armaments Albert Speer, reviewed the two prototypes. Guderian, the frontline soldier, passionately argued for the simpler, more reliable Daimler-Benz copy. He knew what the front needed: numbers, reliability, and a machine that worked. But the Waffenamt and, ultimately, Hitler, were seduced by the MAN design. Why? It was a decision of pure hubris. The MAN proposal looked more German. It was more sophisticated. It was a thoroughbred. The DB design was seen as a primitive copy, an admission of industrial defeat. Hitler, obsessed with technological wonder weapons, chose the complex, superior MAN design. This decision, made in a comfortable Berlin office in May 1942, would have catastrophic consequences. The VK-30-02M was approved for production. It would be named the Panzer Kampfwagen V, the Times Panther asterisk. Germany had just committed its strained industrial base to building a complex 45-ton monster. It was already 15 tons over the original 30-ton specification, that required over 300,000 man-hours to produce nearly double that of a Panzer IV, and exponentially more than a T-34. The T-34 shock had forced Germany to respond, but their own arrogance, their refusal to accept the genius of simplicity, had ensured their response would be a flawed one. They had chosen to build a complicated, unreliable, and expensive superweapon to fight a tank that was, above all, simple and available. The Panther was born, a brilliant, deadly, and fatally over-engineered beast. July 1943. The plains of Kursk. The T-34, the machine that had shattered the Wehrmacht's confidence in 1941, is now charging into a wall of its own creation. The shock has reversed. The German industrial response, the over-engineered but brilliant Panther and the fortress-like Tiger, are here in force. This is Operation Citadel, the greatest tank battle in human history. And for the crews of the T-34 divided by 76, the Hunter has become the hunted. The 76, 2mm gun, the weapon that had been all-powerful 2 years prior, is now suddenly, terrifyingly, as impotent as the German 50mm gun had been against times the asterisk. The finest tank in the world is, for the first time, obsolete. The psychological trauma of this realization, for the Soviet tankers, was just as profound as the T-34 shock had been for the Germans. The historian Artem Drabkin, in his priceless collection of tanker interviews, "I Fought in a T-34, captured this new terror. His subjects, the veteran tankers, described the Battle of Kursk with a new kind of fatalism. One tanker, Nikolai Zeleznov, recalled his first encounter with a Tiger. "We hit him. We saw the sparks fly, but he kept coming. We hit him again. Nothing. He was firing at us. We just couldn't penetrate him." Another T-34 commander, Vasily Bryukov, described the Panther as a nightmare. He said, "Our 76mm guns couldn't penetrate their frontal armor, even at close range. It was a tragedy for us. They could knock us out from 1,500, even 2,000 meters. We had to get within 500 meters into their suicidal kill zone just to have a chance." The T-34 divided by 76, once a fortress, was now a coffin for four brothers, as its crews bitterly called it. Its two-man turret, always its greatest weakness, was a crippling disadvantage in a high-speed duel. The commander, who was also the gunner, was hopelessly overworked. He was trying to find targets, aim the gun, command his driver, and listen to the radio, all at the same time. The arrival of the T-34 divided by 85 and its five-man crew, a dedicated commander and a dedicated gunner, was a revelation, but the tank's core crude nature remained. On the German side, the psychological relief was immense. The confidence, the arrogance of 1941 was back, but it was a harder, more professional confidence. They were no longer the invincible masters of a new doctrine. They were the technological elite, the operators of superior, war-winning machines. The memoirs of German tankers from this period, like Tiger commander Otto Carius, are filled with a new hunter spirit. While Carius himself fought in the north, his accounts of the Tiger's capabilities reflect this new reality. He describes duels where his 88mm gun could destroy Soviet tanks with impunity, one after another, from ranges they could not even comprehend. After-action reports from the Panther units at Kursk, such as those from the 51st and 52nd Panzer battalions, tell the same story. Despite the Panther's disastrous mechanical failures, transmissions and engines bursting into flames, the tanks that times did times make it to the front line were untouchable. They were, in a one-on-one fight, the new kings of the battlefield. And now, the industrial hammer. The T-34 shock of 1941 had forced the Germans into a 3-year, high-stakes gamble on complex wonder weapons. The Panther shock of 1943 forced the Soviets to spend about 3 months' times designing an upgrade. This is the ultimate, decisive expression of the two industrial philosophies. The Germans saw a problem and designed a complex, perfect, and expensive solution times, the Panther. The Soviets saw a problem and designed a simple, fast, and cheap fix asterisk. The Soviet response was not to design a super tank from scratch. They did not panic. They iterated asterisk. They knew their chassis, their V2 engine, and their Christie suspension were still brilliant. They were proven, reliable, and, most importantly, they were rolling off the assembly lines at the rate of 1,000 per month. The problem was not the tank, it was the turret and the gun asterisk. So, they simply fixed them. Soviet engineers, in a furious burst of pragmatic design, took the T-34's hull. They designed a new, much larger turret ring. On top of this, they placed a new 3-man turret, finally giving the T-34 commander his own dedicated seat and cupola. This single change, a direct copy of the German ergonomic design, instantly doubled the tank's tactical effectiveness. Then, into this new turret, they put a new gun, a high-velocity 85mm anti-aircraft gun, the 52K. This gun could fire an armor-piercing round capable of penetrating the Panther's frontal turret armor at 1,000 meters, and, more critically, could kill a Panzer IV or a Stug at any combat range. The new tank was designated the T-34 divided by 85. This was the war-winning weapon. The T-34 divided by 85 was not as good as a Panther one-on-one. Its armor was still the same. Its optics were still inferior. but it was times good enough asterisk. And it could be produced in quantities the Germans could only dream of. While German factories were being bombed to rubble, struggling to produce a few hundred complex Panthers a month, which were then breaking down on their way to the front, the Soviet Times, Tankograd's Times, simply switched their production lines. The T-34 divided by 85 was the ultimate expression of the Soviet design philosophy, good enough and available in mass. It was the perfect, pragmatic, and decisive times, evolution times of a legend. July 4th, 1943. A suffocating summer dust hangs over the Kursk salient. The Wehrmacht, in a desperate final gamble to regain the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front, has gathered its new industrial children, the products of the T-34 shock. Operation Citadel is about to begin. This is not just a battle, it is the final, violent examination for two competing philosophies of war. On one side, the German response. The Panther, a 45-ton, over-engineered thoroughbred designed for technological perfection, the very symbol of quality over quantity. On the other, the Soviet incumbent, the T-34 divided by 76, the good enough workhorse, the symbol of pragmatic mass production. The 1941 shock had forced both sides to this point. Now, in the fields around Prokhorovka, the final, bloody verdict on which philosophy would win the war was about to be rendered. The German spearhead was the brand-new Panther, the VK-30-02M, finally unleashed. On paper, it was the most lethal tank on Earth. Its sloped 80mm frontal glacis plate, angled at 55 degrees, gave it an effective armor thickness of 140mm, making it absolutely immune to the T-34 divided by 76's gun at any range. Its own weapon, the long-barreled 75mm Quak 2 liters divided by 70, was arguably the best tank gun of the war, a high-velocity rifle that could punch through 140mm of armor at 1,000 meters. For the T-34 crews, it was a weapon that could kill them from 2 kilometers away, long before they were even in range to fire back. But the Panther's debut, as detailed in the after-action reports of the 51st and 52nd Panzer battalions, was not a triumph. It was a logistical and mechanical catastrophe. The Panther was a machine that had been rushed from the drawing board to the battlefield in less than a year, skipping the vital testing and refinement phase. The result was a thoroughbred with legs of glass. The complex interleaved times, Schachteloff-work times suspension bogged down in the mud. The front-mounted final drives, bearing the weight of 45 tons, sheared off. But the worst, most terrifying flaw was the engine and transmission. The high-performance Maybach engine, crammed into a poorly ventilated compartment, overheated and burst into flames. The transmissions failed with such regularity that tank crews, in a blackly comic twist, were ordered not times to drive their new tanks to the front, but to have them towed. On the other side of the field was the T-34 divided by 76. The machine that had caused the shock in 1941 was now, tragically, the underdog. Its 76mm F-34 gun, once a god-killer, was now firing pathetically useless shells that, as one Soviet tanker recalled, bounced off the Panther like peas. The Soviet tanker accounts from Kursk, collected by historians like Artem Drabkin, are a litany of suicidal bravery and desperation. They knew they could not win a duel. They were hopelessly outranged and outgunned. Their only hope was to revert to wolf-pack tactics. Squadrons of 5, 6, or 7 T-34 seconds would charge one Panther, hoping to get a lucky shot into its thinner side or rear armor. They were ordered to aim for the tracks, for the gun barrel, for anything. In the most desperate moments, Soviet drivers, their guns useless, simply rammed their tanks into the Panthers, a final, sacrificial act to immobilize the German beast. This is the industrial hammer of Kursk. The statistics are a brutal, head-to-head comparison of the two philosophies. The Germans deployed approximately 200 of their brand-new Panthers for the offensive. The Soviets met them with thousands times of T-34 seconds. The gun statistics tell the tactical story. The Panther's Quick 42 could penetrate 140 mm at 1,000 meters. The T-34 divided by 76's F-34 gun could penetrate about 60 mm at 1,000 meters. The Panther was, one-on-one, the undisputed master. But the most important statistic from Kursk is this: non-combat losses. On July 5, 1943, the first day of the offensive, the 4th Panzer Army reported its Panther strength. Of the 200 tanks that started the attack, only 38 were combat-ready by the evening. The remaining 162 were not destroyed by Soviet fire. They were broken down. They had been lost to engine fires, failed transmissions, and broken final drives. The Panther, the pinnacle of German out-engineering, the complex answer to the simple T-34, was a mechanical failure. It was a wonder weapon that did not work. At Kursk, the Panther won almost every tactical, one-on-one duel it fought. It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it was the superior times tank asterisk. But the T-34, even as it burned in the thousands, won the Times War asterisk. The Soviets could replace their losses. The T-34, even when outclassed, was reliable, easy to fix, and available in massive, overwhelming numbers. The German philosophy of complex, over-engineered perfection had been tested against the Soviet philosophy of pragmatic, mass-producible good enough. Kursk was the final exam. The T-34 had passed. The Panther had failed. The year is 1944. The offensive is Operation Bagration, the total, planned destruction of German Army Group Center. We are inside a T-34 divided by 85, part of the 5th Guards Tank Army. The world is a claustrophobic, deafening, and suffocating hell. The V2 diesel engine is not just a sound, it is a physical concussion, a continuous roar that vibrates through the steel floor, up the crew's legs, and into their teeth. The air is a thick, hot soup of diesel fumes, cordite from the 85mm gun, and the ripe, acrid smell of 4 other unwashed, terrified men. The tank lurches violently, throwing the crew against the hard steel of the interior. The commander, his head in the new cupola, is screaming orders, but they are inaudible. He communicates with his driver, as all T-34 commanders do, by kicking him left boot on the left shoulder for turn left, right boot on the right shoulder for turn right, both boots on his back for go, go, go. The T-34 was a war-winning industrial product. For the men inside, it was a crude, brutal, and profoundly dangerous instrument. Its victory was not just one of industrial might, it was a victory of human endurance, a testament to the raw, fatalistic courage of the men who crewed it. To understand the T-34 is to understand the sacrifice of the men who had to compensate, with their blood, for every one of its good-enough design flaws. The primary evidence for this human cost comes from the priceless, searing interviews collected by historian Artem Drabkin in his book, I Fought in a T-34. The crews, who were often just teenagers, describe a life of constant, grinding terror. In the T-34, divided by 76, the 4-man crew was a flawed organism. The commander, who also served as the gunner, was, as tanker Vasily Bryukov stated, catastrophically overworked. He was trying to find targets, aim and fire the gun, and command his driver, all at the same time. The arrival of the T-34 divided by 85 and its 5-man crew, a dedicated commander and a dedicated gunner, was a revelation, but the tank's core, crude nature remained. The driver mechanic, the Times Mechanic Voditel asterisk, sat in the front, isolated. His was a job of pure, physical brutality. He wrestled with the tank's dry clutch transmission, a primitive crash box system that required a sledgehammer to service and the strength of a bear to operate. Tanker Nikolai Zeleznov recalled, "To shift gears, I often had to use my knee to get enough leverage. My hands were always calloused and oily." he was also the most vulnerable. A direct hit on the sloped glacis plate, even one that did not penetrate, would often jam his escape hatch, turning the driver's compartment into a steel coffin. The flaws of the crude Soviet design philosophy were paid for by the crew, every minute of every battle. The optics were a primary complaint. While German tankers had clear, high-magnification Zeiss sights, Soviet tankers peered through muddy, low-quality periscopes. Many tankers reported that the periscopes were so bad they were half-blind, forcing them to drive with their hatches open, exposing their heads to shrapnel and sniper fire. The lack of a proper intercom system, a standard feature in every German Panzer, was another brutal flaw. The kicking system was the only way to communicate in the roar of battle, a primitive, physical system that was hopelessly slow in a fast-moving, high-stakes duel. But the most terrifying flaw was a phenomenon called spalling. The T-34's armour, while thick, was often of poor quality, especially in the rushed mid-war production. It was hard, but brittle. When a German shell struck the outside, even if it times did not penetrate, times the force of the impact would cause the times inside times of the armour plate to shatter, sending a high-velocity spray of white-hot steel flakes, or spall, flying through the crew compartment. Tanker Mansur Abdulin remembered this horror vividly. A shell hit the front. It didn't go through. But, my God, the driver was screaming. The spall had ripped his face to shreds. The interior was full of hot, razor-sharp steel. This was our armour, killing us from the inside. This brings us to the final grim industrial hammer, the human statistic. The T-34's good enough doctrine was a war-winning strategy, but it was paid for almost entirely with the lives of its crews. The casualty rates for Soviet tankers were among the highest of any branch in the Red Army, which is to say they were among the highest in human history. In the desperate battles of 1943 and 1944, the life expectancy of a new T-34 crewman was often measured in times weeks asterisk, and sometimes just in a single battle. The Soviets produced T-34 seconds by the tens of thousands, and they burned through their crews just as fast. The training was often rudimentary. New crews were sometimes sent to the front with only a few hours of driving or gunnery practice. They were, in effect, human ammunition, fed into the meat grinder to compensate for the tank's ergonomic and safety failures. The T-34 was a legend. It was the tank that saved the Soviet Union, but its victory was not clean. It was a victory purchased by the blood, the endurance, and the almost superhuman courage of the men inside. They were the ones who had to overcome the crude transmission, the poor optics, the spalling armour, and the overworked command system. They were the ones who had to charge the superior Panthers, knowing they were in an inferior machine. The T-34 was a good enough tank, but it was crewed by men of impossible, extraordinary bravery. We return to the thesis we established at the beginning of this journey. The story of T-34 shock is not merely the story of a new tank. It is the story of a psychological atom bomb, a moment in 1941 when the invincible Wehrmacht stared into the face of a machine that should not have existed, and for the first time, felt the icy grip of strategic fear. That fear, born in the fields of Lithuania and on the road to Moscow, did not end with the war. It fundamentally, violently, and permanently altered the course of military history. The T-34's legacy is not just its victory in the Second World War, it is the fact that it killed a philosophy of war and created a new one in its image. Before 1941, the Wehrmacht's doctrine, championed by Guderian, was one of specialization. The Panzer III was the duelist, the anti-tank rapier. The Panzer IV was the infantry support sabre. It was an elegant, balanced system. The T-34 was none of these. It was a crude, all-purpose sledgehammer. Its 76mm gun was not a specialized weapon. It fired both high explosive and armor, piercing rounds with equal, brutal effectiveness. Its armor was thick enough. Its speed was high enough. It was not a specialized duelist. It was the world's first true main battle tank, the single machine that could do everything. This was the true revolution. It rendered the German philosophy of specialized panzers obsolete overnight. The post-war German assessment, written in the bitter clarity of defeat, confirms this. Heinz Guderian, in Panzer Leader, and Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, in Panzer Battles, both return to this theme again and again. The T-34, they argued, was a times trap asterisk. The shock it induced in 1941 was so profound that it forced the German High Command and Hitler himself into a reactive, desperate, over-engineering death spiral. The T-34 forced the creation of the Panther. The KV-1 forced the creation of the Tiger. These were brilliant, magnificent tactical weapons, but they were an industrial and strategic disaster. They were too complex, too expensive, and too few. Guderian, the pragmatist, had seen this in 1941. He had begged his superiors to times copy, times the T-34, to embrace its simplicity. Their pride refused. Instead, they built wonder weapons that could not be produced in numbers, that broke down constantly, and that consumed Germany's dwindling industrial capacity. The T-34, by its very existence, had dictated the terms of the industrial war, a war Germany was guaranteed to lose. This lesson was not lost on the other great industrial power in the world, the United States. While the Wehrmacht was being seduced by complexity, the US Army Ordnance and British technical missions were conducting their own autopsies on captured T-34 seconds. They saw exactly what the German Times Panzer Commission Times had seen: crude welds, primitive ergonomics, and poor finishing. But they also saw the core of its genius: a reliable diesel engine, a simple, wide-track suspension, and a design optimized not for the craftsman, but for the Times assembly line asterisk. The T-34 was the ultimate proof of a new, terrifying concept. Quantity has a quality all its own. This philosophy became the bedrock of the American war effort. The American M4 Sherman was, in many ways, the T-34's spiritual cousin. It was not the best tank on the battlefield one-on-one. A Panther or a Tiger could, and did, destroy it at range, but it was good enough. It was reliable, easy to fix, and, most critically, it could be produced in staggering, war-winning numbers. The T-34 had provided the bloody, undeniable proof of concept for the industrial doctrine that would crush the Third Reich. And that brings us to the final, industrial hammer, the ultimate, crushing statistic that is the T-34's final legacy. The verdict of the entire industrial war can be written in a single ledger. The Germans, in their pursuit of complex technological perfection, produced approximately 6,000 Panthers, approximately 300 Tiger Is, approximately 498 Tier Tudors. The Soviets, in their relentless, brutal pursuit of a good enough sledgehammer, produced approximately 84,000 tons, 34 seconds, in all variants. That is the entire story. The Wehrmacht's 1,941 arrogance, its belief in the invincible Panzer III and IV, was buried under an avalanche of 84,000 tanks. The T-34 shock was not a fleeting moment of panic. It was the starting gun for an industrial race that the Third Reich, with its philosophy of over-engineered wonder weapons, had already lost. The T-34's true legacy is its children: the T-54, the T-62, the T-72, the entire concept of the modern, disposable, mass-produced main battle tank. It was the tank that proved that in a total, global war, a complex, perfect weapon is useless if it arrives too late, and in too few numbers. It was the simple, crude, brilliant machine that buried German arrogance under a mountain of steel.